Hello and welcome to WLC 311 Module 14. In this module we're going to continue our discussion of second language acquisition. We touched upon this one in class on Friday. The question is, does L2 acquisition differ from L1 acquisition? There are two views. One is no, it is based on the same innate principles. And the second view is yes, if learned after puberty. One of the differences between L1 acquisition and L2 acquisition is whether or not a negative feedback is needed. And as we discussed last time, negative feedback is definitely needed in the L2 classroom, which makes it very different than from the L1 classroom. We've already seen that negative feedback, in other words, correction, doesn't work for children, but adults seem to need it. And as we discussed, there are three kinds of corrections. One kind of correction is recast. So a student, to use English as an example, says, I eated bananas. And the instructor says, I ate bananas. For negative feedback to be effective, you need what's called uptake. So the student has to notice the error and then correct the error in his or her own grammar. So that's what uptake means. So as we discussed in class, recasts are useless. Lots of times the students don't even hear it. It can annoy students, and they do not show uptake when that's done. Negotiation, on the other hand, and again, this is a Canadian immersion French language class. Negotiation is where the student says, I eated cheese, and I say, you ate cheese, he ate cheese, and I give the a regular form, and then I say I, and I wait for the student to say ate. That's negotiation, and that is the most effective method, but you can see even in Canadian immersion French language class, that's not used. Metalinguistic correction is, I would say, okay, so eat, what's the past tense? Yesterday. And then the student may or may not say I ate, and then I say something like, right, I ate. In a language course in this country, the 60% of recasts, most of that would go to the metalinguistic correction. If you look in your language classes, if you listen to how correction is made, a lot of it is metalinguistic correction, where we talk about grammar in an abstract sense. Negotiation, which is the least effective, negotiation, which is the most effective, is going to be used far less. All right, what do we know about L2 learning? Well, first of all, it's a system. Just like children have a system, L2 learners have a system. It's not arbitrary. So, to give you an example, we have the preterite and the imperfect in the languages that you study. The last kind of verbs that students will acquire are what we call stative verbs. So, for example, the verb to be. So, être or ser or essere, those verbs are going to be the most difficult for students to acquire. On the other hand, something like dance, that's going to be much easier because you know that the action is in progress or it's background information, but the verb to be is much more difficult. So if you have this knowledge, if you're armed with this knowledge when teaching the preterite and the imperfect, you're not going to expect verbs like to become, to seem, to be correct. So ideally, you wouldn't give those verbs. If you think you have to give these verbs for some unknown reason, then you have to assume that they're going to get them wrong. So they're going to basically understand the preterite and imperfect of those verbs in the third year or never. So again, don't put those verbs on a test, especially a test before the third year, because students are going to get them wrong. So when we say it's a system and it's not arbitrary, we know in which order students learn things, and we know that this is a system that they have. It's just that those verbs are not included. Now, the impact of teaching methods If we use drills and grammatical explanations, we're not understanding that L2 learning is a system, and these are completely ineffective. If we view language errors as habits, then we have a behaviorist view, don't we? For both the drills and the grammatical explanations, and then again for the habits. We have a behaviorist view of second language acquisition. How do we view errors? Are errors expected? Are errors despised? Do you make students feel stupid because they make errors? You tell them, by the time you're in third year, you should understand this. Well, maybe. But again, the students are never, ever going to get everything 100%. So if you view errors as part of the learning process, and there are good errors and bad errors, I eated isn't a bad error. That student has internalized how past tense is formed and given eated. So that's a good error. Now, after they've been exposed to the language, say, for example, this particular verb form, we would say after they've been exposed to the language for a semester, then they should be internalizing the suppletive forms. All right, this is from Virginia Scott's presentation at the Modern Language Association, and she's talking about multi-competence. Now, the father of multi-competence is Vivian Cook. And again, his idea is based on three principal ideas. We have the L2 user, we have the native speaker problem, and we have a dynamic understanding of bilingualism. Now, these are quotes, and that's why I'm using quotation marks at the beginning. These are quotes from her presentation. All right, so what does the L2 user do? The L2 user uses a language other than his or her first language. That's the L2 user. And basically, we have the competence that we need to have. So if you are going to need to go to the doctor in your second language, then that's a piece of competence that you have. If you're not going to need to go to a doctor, then that's irrelevant. You would need to go to a doctor, obviously, if you're going to live in that country. But if you're not going to live in that country, that's probably not needed. Do you need to negotiate a contract? Do you need to read a poem? I might need the level of French. Well, I do need the level of French to where I can teach a history of the French language course in French. Will you need that level? You may need a high degree of proficiency in French depending on what you need it for, but I don't think you're going to need that vocabulary or that understanding. For the L2 user, for Cook, is someone who uses a second language at any level. All right, so what we have to do is start empowering students, start making them feel like a successful L2 learner when they actually are. So as we've discussed in class several times, you have to eliminate the native speaker standard. So students are never going to have the proficiency of a native speaker. Holding them to that level is at best shows no understanding of L2 acquisition, and at worst is extremely frustrating to students. And they feel like they don't measure up. Do you feel like you don't measure up in your L2? If you do, most likely it's because you've been compared to a native speaker standard. Your students will make errors, and they will always make errors. So as we've discussed in class before, why aren't we giving students freebies, especially if they're writing a composition in class? They're going to make errors with things like grammar or agreement, English speakers learning one of their Romance languages. So we expect errors. And we have to have some kind of understanding of L2 use. And that's where linguistic training comes in. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to understand. All right. So again, L2 use is not comparable to native-like speech. Cook notes that few L2 users can pass for native speakers. They were going to have a non-native accent, the vocabulary. We can learn a language, and you can see this too with L2 users of English in this country. Again, that's not the goal. Sometimes you can pass for a native speaker depending on how much you talk about. So basically, we are not going to reach full mastery of our second language And this is supported by research. And again, these are quotes from Scott 2009. That's why they are in quotation marks. All right, so what happens with traditional learning goals? We have this proficiency in these 4 skill areas, and we'll talk about that later. We have grammatical competence, by which we mean not using the language, but being able to take a test. And those are far different. So those of you who've studied abroad or traveled abroad know very well that being able to take a test is not going to help you get very far in that country. And you have to have some knowledge about the target cultures. We have target language input. We have interaction about topics of personal interest. That's our approach. We focus on sentence grammar, and we discuss culture in the target language. Interestingly enough, the outcome is not very good. We have we identify, quote, good language learners. Only 20% of students continue their study of the target language beyond their language requirement. Only 20%. And once you leave the classroom, sometimes in a weekend, you're going to have a rapid attrition of your language, and you're going to believe that you are a deficient language learner.